Well, good morning, North Hill. So good to be with you all, and I've missed being with you for a while, just having to work schedule right now, but it's so good when I get to be here and just be with the family, the church family here. So this video, this scene, takes us back to the beginning, as in the beginning, as in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he made in that creation male and female, man and woman, and he told them, he said, you can do whatever you want. There are no rules. This entire universe is yours, and you can do anything you want. Absolutely no rules except for one. I just don't want you to eat this tree over here because it's not good for you. Other than that, do whatever you want. No rules, just right. The world is yours. But if you know the story, you know that the enemy of God, through a serpent, enticed them, and they partook of the very one single thing that God said don't do, and they did it. And in that moment, in that choice, when they decided to do the one thing God asked them not to do, sin entered the world. Whatever it is that you hate, whatever it is in this world, whether it's thoughts, whether it's actions, whether it's whatever it is in this world that you hate, happened in that moment when sin entered the world. That if sin hadn't have entered the world, there would be nothing. All would be perfect. All would be good. But in that moment, sin entered the world and everything turned bad. And it is not a coincidence that in the same moment that they made that choice and sin entered the world, and the ultimate and the only bad news that there's ever been became, it is in that same moment that God uttered the proto-evangelium. Now there's your word of the week. How's that for your word of the week? Try that one 10 times in a row. And it's just simply a fancy theological term that references our verse, the next verse, the Genesis 3. And this passage, this one little verse, entire libraries could be filled with the pages that have been written about this one verse throughout history. It's a profound statement, and it is a promise that was made in the very moment that bad news entered. The proto-evangelium is a Latin word that means protos, first, evangelium, the good news. And so as bad news entered the world, in the same moment, God comes and he issues the good news, and he issues the promise. And this promise, this statement, this proto-evangelium, this first gospel, this first good news in the light of the bad news is strange. I mean, just looking at it, it's kind of weird. But first of all, it's weird because this grand statement, this ultimate statement, bad news is in the world, God ushers good news. This statement is a curse spoken to a snake. Now, I don't know how long you've been alive, but I'm guessing that's something new to you. You probably haven't ever witnessed a curse spoken to a snake. Pretty weird situation that God chooses this critical first promise of good news that would last through eternity was a curse spoken to a snake. Let me say this. If you think you've got God figured out, maybe this will throw a wrench in it, right? He doesn't think like we think. He doesn't act like we think. And so this first promise, this grandiose declaration, is a curse made to a snake. But not only is that weird, but the statement is weird. He's talking to this serpent, who, of course, is Satan working through the snake. And he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her seed and your seed. Now, to a Jewish reader, this is especially weird because he's making reference to the seed of a woman. Now, and of course, most ancient cultures of that time, but especially Judaism, was a patriarchal culture. When you read their genealogies, it was also, Sam begot Bob, who begot Jim Bob, who begot Tom, and it was always male, patriarchal, and a male, and so they would refer to the seed of the man. But in this declaration, the Holy Spirit makes a strange statement that there will be enmity between you and the seed of the woman. And one of the interesting things about prophecies in Scripture is they always are weird like that. These statements that we read throughout history promising this day, they're always weird statements that don't make any sense to the people who are reading it. They're just going, what? It's almost like a little puzzle piece, and you're looking at the whole puzzle, and you just see this little piece, and you're thinking, how does this fit in this big puzzle? But once the puzzle is done, then you go, whoa, and it all becomes real. So it's 1,000+ years later that Isaiah comes along, and he adds to, and he gives another little hint to this proto-evangelium, to this first gospel message, this first promise, and he says, behold, the virgin. Not a virgin, the virgin. Well, who's he talking about? He's talking about this statement, this seed of the woman, this unique declaration of a woman and a seed. What is all that about? So Isaiah comes along and says, behold, I'll tell you a little more. I'll give you another hint. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. God is with us. So this weird statement that was made at the beginning of time, Isaiah adds a little hint to it, and he says the seed of the woman is reference to a virgin, and this virgin is going to give birth to God. Well, again, as you can imagine, the Jewish readers, that's still kind of weird. Like, what? Say that again? How's this word? They're still not clue. And so throughout biblical history, God was constantly giving them these hints, these little clues, these little puzzle pieces, and if they put them together, it still makes sense, but he constantly did it, and throughout history, they could rely on it, and the prophets would speak, and God would speak, and he'd give them little ideas, and it's going to be the branch of David, and all these different things that he's telling them, until suddenly, it stopped, and there was silence, and the people waited. And they wondered, is God going to speak again? And they waited 100 years and nothing. They waited 200 years and nothing. They waited 300 years and nothing, until finally in our text, 400 years later, we come to our text, and finally the silence is broken and God speaks. And he speaks to a couple of young kids who were nobodies. We know Joseph and Mary like the household names. They were nobodies. They were nobodies just like, well, I'll just speak for myself. I won't include you. Nobody's like me, right? Maybe you guys are all everybody's, but nobody's like me. Nobody's. God chose these two people out of nowhere, and he breaks the silence, and he speaks to them, and we come to our text, the next slide. And what is interesting about this text, among a lot of things we could say, but there is a verb in our text that is very, very significant. And this verb that is in our text, you may have missed, as I probably would have missed it as I was reading it. But this verb is used 9 times in our text. And this verb is significant because it is rooted in God's very name. You remember Moses when he was getting ready to go to Pharaoh, he came to God and he says, look, I'm going to go to Pharaoh. What should I tell him your name is? Who should I tell him sent me? And you remember God told him, he says, tell them my name is I am. He says, I am what I am. And I always think of Popeye when I read that statement. He's stronger than Popeye. But he says, I am is my name. And that not only is I am the essence of being, that's the essence of all there is, that verb, but we understand I am as several things. First of all, I am is I was. Wrap your head around that for a minute. That no matter what time you think of, no matter how far back you want to go into eternity, he was. He never started. Well, that'll blow your mind. I am, first of all, is he was. It is also I am. I am here. I am present. I am alive. I am thriving. I am working. I am here. But it's also that verb, I will be. And we see that verb multiple times in our text in which God says, I will be doing this. And when the I am says, I will, we can have hope that it will. Am I right? When the I am speaks, I will, it is his essence. Nothing else can happen. And because the I am speaks, I will, we have hope. But here's the problem. We live in a world, well, just think about the word hope for one thing. It's interesting that as we use the word hope, we understand, and at least in the English language, we understand that as I hope for things, I acknowledge the fact that there's a reality that what I hope for may not happen, right? I mean, it's in the very use of a word. We say, I hope I can retire early. I hope I can get a promotion. I hope my kids grow up healthy. I hope as I'm walking down the street, I kick up a piece of paper, and as I'm kicking it, my foot scratches it, and it pops up, and it lands in my hand, and it's a winning lottery ticket, right? I mean, we hope, but in our hope, we understand the fact it may not happen, and we're content with that. We're also similarly content in the world that we live in when somebody says, I will. We've learned to acknowledge the fact in the back of our head, yeah, maybe, right? And in fact, our culture is growing more and more and less dependable, less and less trust, and less when somebody tells you something to be able to say yes. Good. That's great. We've become content with the fact that when someone says, I will, we become content with the fact that when we have hope, that it may not happen. But when the I am speaks, I will, it is a living hope. Do you remember Peter made that statement? Peter was writing to a persecuted church, a church that was enduring immense, horrible atrocities because of their faith. And he's writing to them and he says, we have been begotten to a living hope. What's a living hope? A living hope is it takes that part of us that says, yeah, maybe, hopefully, yeah, it'd be great if it does. Living hope takes that out and says, because the I am speaks, it will be. And it is a living hope, you remember Peter says, because of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The reason this morning, as we talk about hope, the reason we not only have hope, we have a living hope, is because that infant child that we celebrate this week was put to death by the same enemy, and yet 3 days later rose again. Because of that fact, we have hope. Which leads us back to the proto-evangelium, if we can get back to that slide. The next thing he says, you notice, he says, I will put enmity between you, the snake, and the woman, between your seed and her seed. So we understand, okay, first of all, he's promising that a woman, somewhat strangely, and of course a virgin, is going to give birth to a child. But then he says, he, referring to the seed of the woman, shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Again, to Jewish readers reading this throughout centuries, it's like, what on earth are you talking about? The seed of the woman and the bruising and the snake and all this stuff. And it's just a classic scenario of a snake, right? What does a snake do? When a snake attacks, it attacks your heel with the intent of hurting you, destroying you, and maybe even taking you out. And so the snake, this serpent, the enemy of God, he's saying to him, you are going to try and destroy this child. You are going to try and destroy the seed. This enmity between you, you're going to try and put an end to it. And when he raised up Judas, and when he got the people and the crowds and the mobs, and he got the governing officials, and he got the religious leaders, and he got them all stirred up so that they shouted, crucify him, crucify him. You can imagine the enemy smiling. You can almost hear him laughing with hatred and venomous hatred, because he's finally getting back at his ultimate enemy, at the Creator, and he's destroying it, and he's watching as that final breath of the Messiah leaves him, and he says, yes. But what he doesn't know is that all that he did was merely strike the heel. But 3 days later, that same one would turn around, come back to life to crush his head. There is no better news than that. There's nothing. Just as there is no other bad news in our life besides sin and the reality of sin and the darkness in this world, there is no greater good news than that proto-evangelium, that first promise that God had made to his people. I'm trying to think where I'm at in time. If I'm almost done, could you give me 5 minutes? Okay, even 6 maybe. We'll shoot for 4 and then I'll wrap it up. I want to talk about something that I think is really important as we talk about this understanding that if we can grasp that he is alive, then we have living hope, right? We got that connection, and I think we understand what having living hope would mean in our lives. It would change us completely. It would change the world completely. And I want to bring something out as to how we can absolutely know that he's alive. And I'll explain it this way. I'm a moderator on an online forum for musicians, and about 80%. I moderate the political religious section, and probably 80% of the participants are either atheists or agnostic, and then about 20% of us are, a broad range of believers. So we have some great discussions. A lot of these guys are very, very intelligent, far more intelligent than I am. So we have these great discussions. And this, a couple weeks ago, we were having one about the reliability of the New Testament. Is the New Testament a reliable document? Is the document that says Jesus is alive, is that reliable? Can we trust it? Great question. And so one of the guys kind of flippantly made this statement. He says, we know the New Testament is a joke because it was written 40 years after the fact. And what he didn't realize, what he was saying in that statement, is exactly the opposite. The fact that it was written within 40 years guarantees it's reliable. Because every other religious document, whether you're talking about the Book of Mormon, the Quran, and all those other religious documents, were written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later after the fact. But the New Testament was written in the same generation as the people who saw it. The best analogy I can think of is 9/11. Some of you maybe weren't even born in 9/11, but for those of us who've been around, even those who haven't been born, if someone were to come along and say, and it's been 24 years. So let's fast forward 16 more years to 40 years. Don't figure out how old you'll be or what you look like. Just go with me for a minute. 16 years from now. Oh man, that's scary. Okay, so anyways, 16 years from now, if somebody came along and wrote a book titled 9/11 Did Not Happen, how well would that book do? Probably be a few silly people that would buy it just for laughter. Just what kind of nonsense is this? Nobody could write a book successfully. Certainly nobody would take that book and copy it and give it to their neighbor and say, have you read this? Interesting. Now, what could happen in the first 40 years is people could write books of conspiracy theories about 9/11. I'm pretty sure those are already out there, are they not? And you can read them, and they're interesting, and they're fascinating. It's like, I didn't know that about the government, and I didn't know that about this. And sure, the conspiracy theories, there'll be plenty of those within those 40 years, but nobody will successfully write a book that says 9/11 didn't happen, because we'd say, give me a break. My Uncle Jimmy died in the towers. I saw it on the TV. I went to New York. I saw the memorial. Nobody could get away with that within the first 40 years. We'd say, give me a break. 600 years from now, they probably could, and people would probably buy it like, I wonder if that's true. But we all are here and know 9/11 happened, and that book is a joke. The people within the generation of that 40 years these books were written to, that they copied and gave to their neighbor and says, yes, this is true. I know, my brother is Lazarus. He was dead, now he's right here. Or my sister, she was blind, and now she sees. Or I witnessed the miracles. Or I saw him walking around. I saw him be crucified, and then 6 days later, he's walking around. I saw it, and they would copy it and give it to their neighbor and say, this is true, I saw it. In fact, Peter, in Acts 2, you remember, as he's preaching to the masses, he says, as you yourselves know. You saw Jesus walking. You saw him be crucified, and you saw him alive. And those people in that generation not only copied it, but they pass it on so that now archaeologically we have tens of thousands of copies of that book, because they knew it happened, they saw it happen, and they copied it down, and they wrote it, and they said to the next generation, I know you didn't see this, but we did, and it's true. That is why 40 years isn't that long. And 40 years, we can know absolutely that tens of thousands of people witnessed what we're reading, and they said, this is true. As we close, I want to look at another I will statement in John 14. And the interesting thing about this context, I think is especially important to me and maybe to you, is what we miss in the context. And what we miss in the context, because of chapter divisions, and starting in chapter 14, verse 1, is what's going on in chapter 13. And what's going on in chapter 13 is Jesus is telling Peter, you will betray me. Now, I think we've learned when the I am says I will, or you will, it's going to happen. He says to Peter, you will turn your back on me. And of course, Peter, being like he says, no, I won't. No, you're wrong, Jesus. Sorry. No offense, but not this time. You just got some bad information. I'm not going to do it. He denies him then. But that is a context in which Jesus says this statement that we may be familiar with. Do not let your hearts be troubled, Peter. Believe also, you believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house has many rooms or mansions. If that were not so, I would have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. I don't know, well, I do know, and maybe you're there now. Maybe you've been at a place in your life, as I have been more times than I care to count, where I felt like I turned my back on him, where I made choices that were not in favor of him, that were in favor of me, bad choices. And I have been in Peter's shoes many, many times. And he speaks to us, even in the midst of our trouble. And he said, let not your hearts be troubled. Because when the I am says I will, we can have hope. And I think it's fascinating to me, I think it's more than a coincidence, that there are two characters, especially in the New Testament, that Jesus in that scene said, you will betray me. Judas and Peter. And both of them did betray him. But Jesus, coming back to the serpent, to the enemy, if you remember in Luke's account, and I'm sure if Kyle hasn't hit this, he will, Jesus says to him, Simon, Simon, the enemy, the serpent of old, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, to crush you, to destroy you, to cause you to fall. Satan has asked permission to sift you like wheat. And Jesus says to Peter, but I have prayed for you, that when you return, you will strengthen your brothers. And the reality is, as much as Judas and Peter both committed the same sin, it was Peter who got back up and kept going. May we be Peter. May we be the ones who, in the face of a living hope, say, Father, because you will, I will. And we want you to know as a church family, that's why we're here. And in a few minutes, Kyle's going to come up, and we want you to know as a church, we're here to pray for you. We're here to love on you. Put your arm around each other and say, we're going to do it. We're going to get that. And as we prepare, as we think about the communion, and we think about Jesus, and he said, this is my body, and this is the blood of my covenant. As we partake of this communion, we are partaking in the incarnation of the one who says, I will return. Amen.